Haidong! In this video, we're going to introduce the skill drill, paper cutting. As with all the other skills drills, the name implies exactly what you're going to be doing, right? So paper cutting, you cut paper. Again, the other major skill drills being bamboo cutting, which is probably the most useful and has the most feedback, where you cut bamboo. There's candle extinguishing or candle snuffing, depending on how you translate or just talk about it, where you extinguish a candle with a cut. And then you also have throw cutting, where you throw an object in the air, again like a ball or an apple or something like that, and you cut it. So again, the names imply pretty happily exactly what we're going to be doing for these skills drills, and they do exactly that. So they work on a very specific skill, and this is, I guess, where some things kind of get mixed up when people either outside the Federation or people within the Federation don't necessarily know exactly what paper cutting is supposed to tell you. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. Transparency, because I like to have it. So this video was inspired by watching Master Jenko from Pittsburgh, watching his video on paper cutting. So he was talking about a couple of different aspects I might repeat here. So for example, he was talking about speed and all that fun stuff, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, but I'm going to prioritize other things just because he said it so succinctly. So what I'm going to do is I can talk about my own interpretation of, again, what you can do with paper cutting and all that fun stuff. But this was inspired by Master Jenko. Another name drop, just because I already dropped one, I might as well drop a few more, right? So I guess leading up to it, so you can use a few different types of paper to get different results. So for example, I'm just going to be using ironed newspaper. Newspaper is probably the most common paper that's kind of big enough for you to get some good results with. But for example, I have also seen a master in Virginia, so Master Adler, be able to cut butcher paper with a jingo, which is also going to be showing you a lot of other things that you can think about and a lot of fun stuff. Again, getting good cutting angles, make sure again the distance is still good and a lot of fun stuff, and also a fun anecdote. So we all had to use jingums to cut it, but what Master Kim saw us doing is like, oh, let me try with a mukgum, and lo and behold, you cut it with a mukgum, so because that's Master Kim for you. So again, you can use different types of paper to get different kinds of results. Most of the discussion I'm going to be showing is going to be with specifically newspaper, just because of its particular grain and stuff like that. So it's not particularly fine in any way. So if you go to competitions, they have finer grained paper. But this is going to give you again a nice happy medium of results. One thing to consider is also that for some reason paper cutting is of the four, the one that kind of gets misunderstood the most. Actually not just outside of the Federation, outside of Gumdo, but even within, right? So for example, I've seen a few videos that are kind of bashing the name of paper cutting on the YouTubes. With some merit, right? But the main idea is there's going to be some nuances to paper cutting that I want to discuss that really make it important, right? So again, many people can kind of just go up to a piece of paper, swing really hard at it, and cut it. I'm going to use quotations there. Cut it, get some sort of result, but it's not exactly what you're looking for. Again, this is not necessarily a miscommunication between Gumdo and non-Gumdo, but even members within the Gumdo community still don't quite understand, again, the true benefits of paper cutting. So let's start talking about, again, the good things about paper cutting. Again, it's a skill drill, so allegedly these are all honing a particular type of skill. So what is paper cutting allegedly honing, right? So what you might think is well, it's going to be working on, the ability to, cut or something like that. But then, cut what, right? Because this is going to be a contrast between, again, paper cutting and bamboo cutting. So bamboo cutting is oh, if I cut this effectively, it's the equivalent of an arm or a leg, or if I have a few bundles, maybe a torso or something like that. So that's all right, so swordsmanship was intended to do battle against persons. So bamboo cutting is probably, again, of the four, probably one of the most useful, at least in terms of getting a feedback of whether or not you would be able to do these things in a morally safe way, right? So what would paper cutting be doing, right? So what is the equivalent of paper cutting if bamboo is the actual body? Well, Unless if you just want to like cut skin at a distance, which don't, because that's, you know, probably on the verge of evil, right? Yeah, so like what is this going to be teaching you? So an analogy that I like to use for this is actually a similar one that I do for using your right and left hand when you cut. So your left hand is your powerhouse. That's your ability to cut through something. That's going to be like your bamboo cutting. So bamboo cutting is your ability to, you know, with power and with precision and with your body motion, cut through something. Versus your right hand, when you do your cut, should be more like a scalpel, right? So we have a hammer and we have a scalpel. It's that scalpel is the fine tuning of that cut, which is exactly what paper cutting is going to be doing. Now, that said, there's a lot more that actually paper cutting can actually provide you. So for example, when you do cut, so this is going to be one of the major benefits. So for example, we usually do cross cuts just because we just hang paper, it's a little bit easier. Now you can do non-cross cuts if you have a different setup. But for now, we're going to work on cross cuts, right? So for example, when we cut, we can see, again, a few different things. So a couple things I want you to think about as you do paper cutting is, so first of all, did it actually cut or did it tear? So if it tears, so you can kind of tell it from crumpling and stuff like that, and I'll show you a few of, close-ups of the video in a little bit. If it crumples and it tears, that means you're too close. Now, does that mean your cut was bad? No, that means you were too close. So that just means you violated like a major premise of the paper cut that makes your, what it can tell you no longer valid, right? So you could have had the most immaculate cut in the world, but you're like a good foot too close. You can't tell anything about that cut except that you were too close. So paper cutting is very finicky. So in that sense, it's actually working on distance, right? So just like with all the other skills rules, right? So obviously bamboo cutting, you're still using the top third of your sword, ideally probably top sixth or so of your sword. So that's going to be working on distance. Obviously sparring is working on distance. Throw cutting is working on accuracy and distance, although you can be a little bit closer and still get some sort of feedback. So again, all of these things are working on distance. Paper cutting is going to be one that's kind of like the most dependent on being a very specific distance. So assuming that you cut it and not necessarily just tear it, also then find, again, the degree of fineness to your cut. Now obviously this is going to be different according to the type of weapon you're using versus the type of paper you're using, right? So for example, if you're using a paper cutting sword against something like this, you're going to get probably the widest range of results. For example, if you're using a dull mukdum, or even as Master Jenko did in his video, a safety sword against paper cutting, or against paper, the results are going to be very different. So you have to gauge the results a little differently according to, again, the weapon that you're using. So for example, using a jingam or a samgato, right, so something like that, against a mere piece of paper is going to give you a very, very fine cut, pretty much like for a much wider range of closeness and stuff like that. There's going to be a lot more forgiving because it's so sharp. Versus a dull sword, you can still be able to cut it, but the edge will be a little bit more frayed, and that's okay for that medium. But for the most part, what I'm going to be doing is using a paper cutting sword when we do paper cutting, because it's going to give you the widest range of results. So for example, with a proper paper cutting sword, you can get a really fine cut if your cut is in the perfect range. Versus you can still get a pretty okay cut, so you can still see like frays and stuff like that, which again might be the type of paper you're using. But again, if you're kind of a bit too close, you might see a little more fraying and stuff like that. But also note, so one major thing that is also very good about this is as you cut in, you can also note when you either get too close. So for example, if you extend a little bit too late, the paper will tell you. Now it won't actually necessarily tell you if you cut too early, but it will tell you if you cut too late, because what we might see is a very clean cut and it starts to get a little more ragged, maybe even blow out if you're really, really deep, right? So that's going to tell you a lot about your extension in your cut as well. The next major aspect to consider is the actual angle of the cut, right? So for example, are you cutting upward during your cut? Are you cutting downward or whatever? Or are you having that nice perfect cross cut, right? So this is going to be a little bit more for the the aesthetic as well, because for example in combat, if you are able to cut someone's hip whether or not it comes up slightly on an angle or down slightly on an angle or perfectly horizontal doesn't really matter, but this is going to be a good way to see like your amount of control and your amount of, again, precision. So one thing that I would recommend, so especially if you do use newspaper, ideally one with actual text, so maybe on the other side, not as much on the other side, but for example, when you see columns of text, try to cut between them, right? So like have specific points that you want to cut. So for example, when you do compete with this, you're going to be given like again different lines to consider. And again, like so for example, like if this slightly darker line was a a 0, and it's kind of like golf where you want again that smallest number. I think I could be insane. That's fine. So you kind of cut here, but it might be like lines going up and down. So if you kind of bifurcate it this way, you're going to take this number and that number, and again that's going to show again how off you were when you cut. But again, so this will tell you again your angle, but your angle is actually going to tell you a little bit more than just that. So this is going to take a little more training for your eye to kind of like gauge what's going on. But for example, when you cut up or down on a certain angle, right, you might realize that your right and left hand are actually shifting dominance halfway through the cut. Right. So for example, that's something that I kind of see, especially when I'm kind of worried about my surroundings, is my right hand dominates when I'm not actively thinking about it sometimes. Right. You can kind of tell that because it might be a straight cut and it starts to like swerve one way or the other because that's just how your right hand switches dominance, and therefore the momentum is going to be changed. So these are again a few, maybe more than a few, maybe more than you actually want to listen to me for. But these are a few ideas for you to consider when you do paper cutting. So in general, you want to be cutting with the very, very edge of the sword for paper cutting, right? So this is working on, again, getting that type of feedback from the paper. So a lot of people set it up, right? Maybe get one good preparation, and then they go for it. So let's take a look, right? So this is at least me attempting to cut at a proper distance, right? So here, one good preparation, and then cut. So notice, so we can actually use this also as an example. The cut itself looked okay, right? So notice here, that is actually a pretty smooth actual cut, right? So there's not really that much jaggedness to it. Although there's a little more jaggedness to the bottom page. So if I kind of take a quick look, right? Right, so notice there's a little bit of jaggedness to the actual cut. Now, part of that is going to be the medium. Part of that's going to be, again, using a not perfect paper, as well as, again, my sword is not particularly sharp, but also my skill level, right? So I am not particularly skilled in the skills drills, right? So I'm able to do them, but it's not my forte, or your forte if you're more into the technically not correct way to pronounce it. But again, so take a look at this particular paper. We kind of use this as a decent look at a decent distance, right? So again, the cut looks very, very clean. So actually, I can bring you over this way. So right. So notice the cut looks pretty okay, right? Now if I kind of like let that drag down a little bit, right? So if I kind of like settle you in this way. Notice I do come up a little bit, right? So although the cut itself looks pretty decent, right? So all that means, so when I do have a decent cut like that, that means the feedback I'm going to get about, again, what I'm seeing is going to be more valid, right? So the feedback I'm getting from this one means I'm coming up a little bit, right? Now that could mean a whole bunch of things, and this is where having either your instructor take a look at how you're doing it, as well as a couple other ways. So for example, I might be coming up in my stance. My arms themselves might be raising a little bit. But it's fairly slight as things go. And this might also be a transition between my left and my right hand. So let's take a look at when you're too close. Now if you're too close, right, so let's just say we're here and this is where I'm extending, right? So if you're too close, this is what's going to look like. Awkward, okay. So as it turns out, I was a little bit too close for that one, but it's still kind of cut, so that's a little bit awkward. But let's take a look, right? So oddly enough, actually the cut itself looks a little bit, where'd you go? There you are. So just like what we saw before, there's a little bit of, actually let's take a look. So what you might think when you first look at that is like, oh, that's not a terrible cut, right? But take a look at this. So I'm going to be behind the camera again. So notice this, right? So everything else looks pretty decent, but then there's that. So what does that tell you? So that means there's a little bit of crinkling at the end, right? So it's not just crinkling, so it did still cut, although this part's probably still meh. That crinkling means I was a little bit too close, right? So that means specifically, so in terms of the whole cut, it was near the end, right? So my distance was actually okay in the beginning, and then it blew out. Now that blowout, as blowouts go, wasn't the worst one you could have. But yeah, so this is something to keep in mind. So if you look at just, one piece of paper or something like that, again, if you take a look at this, you might think like, oh, that's a decent cut, maybe a little bit of funky stuff near there. But as all things considered, it might look okay. But the way you're able to like dissect it a little bit more, right? So you're able to see that slight crinkling in the bottom paper. That's going to show you that you were indeed too close. And again, because of the actually fine cut until that point, that's going to give you a feedback, right? So that means it's going to be like, all right, so first of all, the clean cut means the feedback is genuine. And because the crinkling was near the end, so it was about the last quarter or so, that means my extension was late, right? So let's take a look. This is an example of a paper you just can't get anything from. This is an example of a paper you can't get anything from. There we go. So now it may not look terrible, right? But the reason that you can tell is the actual bottom half, right? So if you take a look at the sheer amount of crumplage, right? So all that means, so yes, the cut was bad, but if you get a paper like this, all that means is that whatever the paper is telling you may not be valid, right? So in this case, it was a bad cut, but it could have been that was a decent cut, but I was way too close. But I've been trying to replicate that bad cut for far too many takes, right? But that's the idea, right? So if you notice that there's that crumpling, you can't really get any information from the paper except for the fact that it crumpled. So again, that could be the paper, it could be you, it could be, again, any number of things, but just keep that in mind. So let's talk about the degree of good cut, right? So let's just say we do get a cut, right? So let's kind of like take a look at, again, what is a good cut, what is a meh cut, and kind of just like gauge from that, right? The first one, I'm going to be too far away, allegedly, right? So if I'm here. So if we're here, right? You probably notice that the paper was being dragged off to the side. You can tell that was, so although it cut, so that again, all that means is that it's going to, like the feedback is valid. I'm actually a bit too far away, or my cut angle was not perfect because there's a little bit of crinkling on the bottom. So again, the top half looked fine, right? And actually at this point I can also talk about the angle associated with it, right? So for me, that looks like I'm coming up a little bit from my left to my right. So again, that might mean my arms are lifting, it might mean my dominance from my left to my right is shifting, it might mean my legs are lifting, right? But again, this cut, all that means is I can get feedback from it. And if you notice that the other side, again, the bottom half is a little bit crinkled, again, that means, again, my cutting angle, so again, the angle of my blade might be a little bit off, or it might be, again, using the wrong part of my sword. So let's take a look at another one, right? So if we are a little bit closer, right? So the intent of that was being a bit too far away. So if we're a little bit closer, right? And let's try it. So notice, I cannot gain any information from this, right? Because of this tear, right? So all that means, again, is that I cannot get any useful information on like cutting and going, anything like that, but it can tell me that I'm just too close. So this was a quick introduction to, again, the idea of paper cutting, right? So there's a lot of good stuff, again, a lot of good feedback you can get from paper cutting, as well as, all the other skills drills that we have in Gumdo. But again, keep that in mind, right? So again, just because something cuts doesn't mean it's a good cut. Just because something didn't cut the paper doesn't mean it's a bad cut. Just being able to understand what it is capable of telling you, right? So I think that's where some of the misunderstanding comes from, again, other martial arts looking in, and also ourselves looking inward as well. There's a little bit of misunderstanding just because, oh, I cut the paper, I'm a good swordsman. Hold on. hey, hang on, let's actually take it, discuss it, digest it, right? Again, with all the other things, again, the things we're going to do with bamboo cutting, checking the angles, cutting the cleanness of the cut, seeing if there's any breaking in the bamboo, all this kind of stuff is going to give you a lot of feedback about your own swordsmanship. So with that, so try your paper cutting, right? So keep these things in mind. Keep in mind the distance. Keep in mind, again, the cleanness of the cut compared to, again, the amount of breakage. So again, how much it was crumpling, especially in the bottom paper for some reason, at least for me. For the bottom paper, a little bit of fraying, kind of again, digest, kind of understand what is going on with the paper. So with that, make sure you stay humble, stay safe, and keep training. Haidong!